Hey class, it's time for another brief break from the Aeneid to talk about some other Roman literature. And today we're going to be talking about the Roman poet Ovid and his sort of epic masterpiece, Metamorphoses. Ovid's an incredibly important author in the Roman canon of literature, and authors down the line like Shakespeare and Ben Jonson and many, many others are really familiar with his works. So he's had a huge impact. So we're going to talk about him today, about Metamorphoses and how it's kind of an epic and kind of not, and then about the specific story we're going to read from Metamorphoses, PYRAMUS and THISBE. So let's get started. All right, so as you may have guessed with some of the other Roman names that we have encountered, Ovid's full name is not actually Ovid. His full name is Publius Ovidius NASO. Quite a mouthful, just kind of like Virgil and Catullus. Ovid was born in Abruzzi, which was not far from Rome, and he was born in a fairly wealthy family. They had enough money that both he and his brother were well educated. Specifically, Ovid was educated in law. Unfortunately for his father, who really wanted that to be the profession that Ovid pursued, Ovid didn't decide to stick with that. And there's actually some evidence that it may have actually been the untimely death of Ovid's brother at the age of 20 that kind of spurred Ovid on to pursue a different career. Maybe a kind of realization that life is short and he didn't really want to spend his life doing something that he didn't really enjoy. And so he decided to pursue a career in poetry. Now, this was partly a matter of the heart and partly just what he wanted to do, but it was also kind of a politically expedient move. Ovid was born the year after Julius Caesar was assassinated. And so Ovid grew up and became a young man under the reign of Caesar Augustus. And in Caesar Augustus's day, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for a politician, right? And if you'd studied law in ancient Rome, that's what you were thinking about going into, was politics. And so there wasn't a lot of political advancement that was possible under a new empire, right? In former days, law meant that you could become a senator, right? And a senator could advance politically and become very powerful, but there wasn't much opportunity for advancement for a politician, for somebody who had studied law in Ovid's day, partly because in many ways conflict and instability was what allowed a politician to kind of leap forward in his career. So because there was a new empire and the Senate was not playing quite as important of a function in Rome anymore, and also because there was just peace, there wasn't going to be a lot of political opportunity for Ovid. So even though he didn't really want to do law in the first place and he really wanted to pursue writing, it was also kind of an expedient move because he recognized that there was a lot more opportunity for a writer and an artist in Rome now. And this was simply because Augustus was a huge patron of the arts. Augustus sponsored cultural advancement, such as literary and artistic and architectural advancement. And so he put money into a lot of that as part of his imperial program. And so Ovid pursuing that meant that he could probably actually do better by being a poet, being a writer, than by being a politician. And it just suited his personality more in the long run. So when he decided to become a writer, Ovid moved to the capital city of Rome. That was the center of cultural life at that time, obviously. And so he really threw himself into life in Rome, and he loved Roman life. At this point in time, you know, there was a lot of kind of stuff with high society and the elite and the wealthy. And Ovid launched himself into all of that, not unlike kind of our celebrity culture today, right? And all of the scandal and the people getting into relationships and falling out of relationships and all that kind of thing that we're very familiar with. That was kind of social life in Rome at the time. And Ovid loved that. He ate that up. not something I particularly admire about the man. I think he was a brilliant author, but I don't really understand his fascination with this kind of celebrity culture and so forth. Part of it, though, Ovid was not, I mean, we've talked about Virgil and how Virgil was a very highly moral person, and he believed strongly in a sense of right and wrong and what you were supposed to do and what you weren't supposed to do. And we've seen that time and time again in the Aeneid. And that's part of what made Virgil admire Caesar Augustus so much. Caesar Augustus had a very strong sense of morality as well, and he believed in this kind of traditional Roman values that were handed down to them from the Old Republic. Those may not be the same as our Christian values, obviously, but he believed strongly in the Roman values. Ovid didn't really believe in any of that. He wasn't kind of the same make as Virgil and Caesar Augustus. So he didn't really believe in the official imperial version of the way you should live that was founded on Roman values. And he was oftentimes somewhat mocking of Caesar Augustus's moral reforms and kind of trying to return to the traditional values of Rome. And this may eventually have been what got him in trouble. You know, he loved kind of the party life and all the celebrity kind of stuff and the relationships and the breakups and the love and the scandal. And all of that was stuff that Caesar Augustus didn't really appreciate. And he really was trying to move Rome away from that. And Ovid didn't want to be moved away from that. He was something of a party animal. Again, not something I really admire about him, but it was something that it was something that was just true about him, right? That was just kind of the way he was. And so this may have eventually gotten him in trouble with Caesar Augustus. About 10 years before Ovid died, he was suddenly banished by Caesar Augustus, banished from Rome, exiled, without warning, and Augustus didn't really give him an explanation and said, this is the specific spot where you are allowed to go, and you're not allowed to go anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And the particular spot that he was banished to was on the coast of the Black Sea, where nobody spoke Latin. And this was really, really a harsh punishment for Ovid in particular. He really felt it. He was away from the city of Rome that he loved and all the high life and the culture. And he was kind of, in his view, he was kind of living with a bunch of country bumpkins. That's kind of what he felt like. And they didn't even speak the language that he loved to write in, the language of Latin. He loved the Latin language, and nobody in that area could speak that. And so he felt that as a real sting as well, and he wrote back to some of his friends, you know, telling them that no one spoke Latin, so he had to talk to himself, and all that sort of thing. He petitioned and wrote letters and all of these things for the remaining 10 years of his life, pleading to be allowed back into Rome, but they kind of fell on deaf ears, and he was never allowed to return, and did end up dying away from the capital. As far as Ovid's works, when he first started out in Rome, he was caught up in writing about the lives of the rich and elegant, and wrote these works that were funny, witty, kind of sarcastic, that were also kind of caught up in all that celebrity culture and scandal and all that sort of thing. So one book that he wrote was The Art of Love, which was actually supposed to be a handbook for seducing people. You can see maybe why Caesar Augustus later, after Ovid had been banished, why he pulled those books out of the library. They were banned from official Roman libraries. He also wrote Cures for Love, and then he also wrote, and this is kind of an interesting one, Cosmetics or How to Care for Your Face. So you can see that he had some interesting interests in writing. Another thing that he did was he wrote a series of fictitious love letters from mythical heroines. So some of the female characters from some of the most famous myths, he wrote love letters, like pretending to be these women, right? Not really pretending. He wasn't expecting anyone to actually believe that he was these women, but it was kind of this new kind of genre of fiction. Rather than telling their story kind of the traditional way, he was kind of telling their story from their point of view, from their love letters to the men that they loved. So that's a very interesting kind of stylistic take and a different way to tell myth that other people hadn't really done, telling the myths in the form of letters. So that's kind of a fun one. And then he also wrote a 15-book poem in the same meter as Homer, and this is what we're going to talk a little bit more about. And people have called this a mythological anti-epic, Metamorphoses. And so it is this book that is written in the style of one of the ancient Greek epics as far as the literary style and the meter and the rhyme and all that sort of thing. But in some ways it's very, very different from the traditional epic. So we're going to talk a little bit about Metamorphoses and how it is alike and different from Homer, and then we'll talk a little bit more about PYRAMUS and THISBE. So a lot of people have classified Metamorphoses as an anti-epic, meaning it kind of poses as an epic, but it's really not epic in the traditional sense of the word. So Metamorphoses uses the same kind of form that Homer and Virgil use, in that it's this long book that is composed of a number of smaller books, in Ovid's case 15, and it's written in poetic verse. And it's actually written in the same meter as Homer's Greek verse, dactylic hexameter. That had kind of recently been polished up and made usable for the Latin language, because we've talked about before, poetry is kind of difficult to transition from one language to another. It's kind of difficult to sometimes do poetry in the same way in different languages. So it had taken a while for them to figure out how to use that Greek meter and rhythm in the Latin language, but they had recently kind of figured that out, and so Ovid he kind of took that and ran with that ancient Greek metrical style of poetry for his Metamorphoses. Although he does that, and that's the way in which it imitates Homer and Virgil in its meter and in its basic structure, Ovid's work is not truly an epic. It's not an epic in the way that Homer's and Virgil's is. It doesn't focus on one person, a famous hero. That's not the main protagonist. In fact, there is not one main protagonist in Metamorphoses. So it doesn't focus kind of on a single character in their story, and it doesn't really tell about any great historical event like the Iliad or the Aeneid. And so instead of that, Metamorphoses is a large collection of myths. So it's almost kind of like a collection of short stories in a way. There's a bunch of different myths that Ovid includes about gods, about demigods, about mortals, but the stories are all tied together by a theme. So rather than telling about one hero or one kind of great historical event, Ovid is talking about one particular theme in his work, and that is metamorphosis, or change, transformation, right? Some classic stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses or Metamorphoses that he tells are Daphne and Apollo, where Apollo wants to be in a romantic relationship with this mortal woman named Daphne, but she doesn't want to do that. She wants to remain a virgin for the rest of her life. And so one of the gods grants her a means of escape, and she turns into a tree in order to be able to escape Apollo. Or there's the story of Arachne. Arachne is a mortal woman, and she believes that she is the best weaver in the world. And she challenges one of the goddesses, saying, I think it's Athena / Minerva, saying, I can weave even better than you. Minerva says, all right, let's put it to the test. And of course, the goddess is the superior weaver, and as punishment, Arachne is transformed into a spider and thus weaves for the rest of her life as a spider weaving her web. So those are some of the examples of metamorphosis that take place in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So there's always some sort of transformation into something else in this collection. And Ovid actually does a really good job. He's an expert at tying the stories into one another. So although there's not one clear protagonist and one clear story arc. There's a bunch of little myths and stories in this book. Ovid does a really good job of kind of moving from one to the next very seamlessly. Sometimes there are multiple stories about the same people that kind of weave one into the other. Sometimes a minor character in the previous story will become a major character in the next story. Sometimes Ovid has the characters tell each other stories, so there's kind of a frame story thing going on, kind of like there was in the Arabian Nights or in the Panchatantra. So there's a real expertness in how the stories are woven together in Metamorphoses, and kind of an in and an out and a moving around, and it all works as a whole, even though it's not all centered around one character. So Metamorphoses really is an anti-epic in many ways. It is a work of epic proportions. It's a large work. It's 15 books long, very similar in structure and style and language to the works of Homer and Virgil. However, it does not follow the traditional structure in terms of subject matter, in terms of protagonist, in terms of the overall arc of the story. It's very different in that regards. It also isn't designed to support traditional heroic values. It's not about a hero, right, as most of the epics are. It's not attempting to follow the hero's journey. There's none of that present in Metamorphoses. It's a very different kind of work and doesn't support the traditional heroic values, mostly because Ovid didn't really support the traditional heroic values. So the story that you're going to be looking at from Metamorphoses is the story of Pyramus and THISBE, and this is really a classic story from Ovid. It's one of the most popular stories to come out of his collection. Shakespeare knew this story very, very well. He, in fact, includes some characters who are going to put on a play of Pyramus and THISBE inside one of his plays, A Midsummer Night's Dream. So there's kind of this play within a play thing going on, but the play that they're performing is the story of Pyramus and THISBE. So the story has an impact on later literary development, but it does originally come from Ovid in Metamorphoses. One of the things to know about Ovid in Metamorphoses, and one of the things that has made this book really last and have an impact, is it's just a really good example of effective storytelling all throughout the book. And in fact, Ovid's skill as a writer and a storyteller are so good that he's still used as a model for novice writers. A lot of beginning story writers are directed to Ovid to kind of look at him as a model of good short storytelling when they're trying to learn how to write the short story. And this skill, in part, is perhaps what made Augustus a little bit afraid of Ovid. He had already known that Ovid's opinions did not line up with his own, but I think it's when Metamorphoses comes out that Augustus really begins to consider Ovid as kind of a political threat, because Metamorphoses is a work of epic proportion, and so his prior works, like The Art of Love and Cures for Love and all of that, were kind of lighthearted, silly, and people weren't taking them super seriously. But in Metamorphoses, he produced a serious work of literature that challenged Augustus's traditional heroic values and the traditional Roman values that the Epic of Virgil promoted. And because Metamorphoses was kind of challenging those values and it was very different, but it was also a work that people were going to take seriously and had been executed with a lot of skill. Ovid was a masterful storyteller. I think that may have been what made Augustus led him to banish Ovid and kind of distance him from the center of society. Because this work was so masterfully done. So some of the masterful technique is in that Ovid kind of flawlessly executes effective storytelling elements almost every time in every story. And part of that is kind of his base formula Ovid's base formula that made his stories really effective was 1, describing 2 very appealing characters, then 2, setting out some sort of cause of conflict in their relationship. And so there was some difficulty that had to be overcome. And then 3, taking those characters and that conflict and leading those events to a clear conclusion. And if you kind of follow that basic formula, you're going to come away with a good short story, which is why people have kept coming back to Ovid as an example of good storytelling. One of the other things to note about Metamorphoses is it is a verse narrative. And so you're familiar with verse narrative already. You read it in the Iliad, you're reading it in the Aeneid now. And verse narrative is simply combining poetry and storytelling. So it has lines written in verse with a specific rhythm, but it still recounts a story with a start, middle, and end, right? And you guys are very familiar with that. And so you'll be familiar with the feel of Metamorphoses because the feel of it is going to be very similar to the feel of the language of the Iliad and the Aeneid, although keep in mind, these are short stories, right? Rather than a long narrative poem like the Iliad and the Aeneid, you're experiencing short bits of it in Metamorphoses. Another thing that I do also want you to pay attention for in PYRAMUS and THISBE, and just in poetry in general, this is a very common poetic technique of symbols. So as a reminder, the symbol is an item, object, animal, or person used to represent something else. So symbols function on 2 levels. They are literally what they are, but they also represent something. And this is very, very common in poetry. And so Ovid uses lots of symbols in his stories because they're written in poetic form. And you would expect symbols in poetry. Even though poetry is telling a story, you still expect symbols to be present. And so you should expect symbols in the poetic storytelling of Ovid as well. A couple symbols to pay attention to in PYRAMUS and THISBE: the brick wall. Kind of be thinking about what that symbolizes as you read the story. And then also the mulberry tree at the end of the story. And what does that symbolize? How does that connect to some of the themes of the story of PYRAMUS and THISBE? All right, so hopefully you guys have learned a little bit about Ovid, or Publius Ovidius NASO, as his long name is fun to say, as well as Metamorphoses and the anti-epic, and a little bit about effective storytelling that Ovid brings to us. So after you finish this video, you will find that a document for PYRAMUS and THISBE has been uploaded. It's a PDF document. It's a short story. It's only about 4 pages in verse, so it's not very long. So go ahead and take a look at that story and read it, and then respond to a few questions afterwards. All right, guys, I hope you guys have a great day.